The Red Lotus of Chastity comes to us from chapter 13 of the Kathāsaritsāgara, the great Indian epic, a compilation of stories by the Brahmin cleric Somadeva, the scholar from the 11th century. He collected these stories as part of a project for the entertainment of the queen, his queen Suryavati. I'm going to butcher a lot of pronunciations here, but he compiled all these stories to entertain her, and you can see some of them are appealing to her specifically, and some of them are a little bit more universal. Here he tells a story of marital fidelity, chastity. And the stereotypical answer to that would be, well, of course, the wife of a king would be very interested in a story of fidelity and chastity. The morals in the story, however, are a little bit more complicated, a little bit more nuanced. You have a strong female protagonist, which is very interesting. The Devasmita, who is a curious example of a strong female. And the story tracks her largely successful, apparently successful mission to protect not only her own virtue, but the integrity of her marriage, to keep her husband from dalliances, let's say. And it's a very interesting story in the way it captures a particular movement, a particular moment in the history of India, where it is largely secularizing, and there is evidence of a strong middle class happening here, developing, and money is just driving everything, as opposed to the more priestly or noble virtues, let's say, the aristocratic virtues. The story itself comes within the Kathāsaritsāgara as a diversion story for the character Vasavendata as she is waiting for her own wedding. She is told a story of marriage. Perhaps she is having some anxieties of her own, and this story is seeking to quell her anxiety and suggest that, well, okay, marriage is fine, marriage is good, and you don't have to worry so much about infidelity, let's say. It starts with the story of a rich merchant whose name was Dhanadatta, who had no sons. So he assembled many Brahmins and said, okay, what are we going to do about this? Well, they tell him a story. Tell him a story of how a sacrifice to the divine, let's say, you sacrifice one son and you get many more. So he had one son and he sacrificed it and got many more. And the moral of that little story within a story is that you have to propitiate yourself for the gods. I'm not sure. It doesn't really add up. There is a sense of illogic to it that I would say is ironizing. Now, significantly, this is a story within a story. This is a frame tale narrative, of course, so this is how these things do. And the essence of frame tale narratives is almost always a sense of distancing, because you are being pushed back. When characters tell stories of characters who are telling stories, you are removed from the action, and so it is somewhat objectified, somewhat ironized even. And the perspective on it is a little bit more hands-off, let's say. At bottom here, though, you have a rich merchant, not a holy person, a person of business, a person of a rising middle class, who is trying to employ the priestly aids or opportunities in the world for a very mundane purpose, to get a son to carry on the family name. This is curious, and there is even the anxious, or there's even the line towards the end of this little story within a story, where the king, what is it? The incident caused a terrific disturbance in the seraglio, and the king himself lamented, my son, like a commoner, after a while when the aunt had removed the child. All right, well, so in this story, the king kills his own son to get his thing, and here he is acting like a commoner. So you get that essence of the merchant who is hearing this story about a king is being told the clues of, well, okay, you want to be something special, you want to be something elite, you want to listen to us because we are special and elite, and we are the establishment, let's say, but the king, that king, he was acting like a commoner. So there's already this troubling notion of class within this, of staying in your lane and not transgressing without it, transcending outside your strict limits, even while it seems to be dangling that in front of you, that notion of, ooh, what did the king do? Because a rich merchant would probably like to be a king. So this merchant goes and he ends up having a son, and he goes to after several years, he goes to the Indonesia, the island of Cathay, and goes looking for a wife for the son. Supposedly he is on a business trip, but actually what he's doing is shopping around for a suitable bride. So again, there's this mixture of business, commercial interests with here romance, with, well, not even romance, but in a way, business is another, or romance is another avenue of business, because we are told that the prospective bride is the daughter of another wealthy merchant. So here you have two merchants who are eyeing one another up and saying, well, okay, we can do business. Why don't we cement this relationship somehow? And this is exactly how the aristocracy has always operated, and why marriage itself was always more of a business proposition. But the two see each other and they fall in love immediately anyway. So there's this weird, like, okay, it's a business arrangement, but still they're in love. All right, fine. The day comes, well, they get married, and she goes back to India proper, and the day comes when the husband, Guastena, has to take a business trip back to Indonesia, and the wife is concerned. She's like, well, you're going to be gone for a while there. That's not a short trip. So how can I know that you're going to stay faithful to me? And they go to a temple, and the god Siva gives them each a red lotus, and they're told to hold the flower throughout their travels, and they will be a sign of fidelity, and that if either one of them should see their flower start to wilt, that would be a sign that their spouse has been unfaithful. Okay, divine intervention. Divine intervention in this story that is very, very secular, that is very commercial, that is very driven by moneyed interests. Everything in this is about moneyed interests. So it's a weird mix. And again, the story within a story just ironizes this all the more. So the husband goes off on this trip. The wife is still worried, but a little bit less so now. And the husband is walking around this island in Indonesia with a flower in his hand, and people are wondering, what is with this? And the four sons of another wealthy merchant, lots of wealthy merchants around here. The four sons of another wealthy merchant notice this, and they ask him, what's the deal? And he tells them, and they say, oh, really? You're concerned about your wife being unfaithful back home, far away, while she's all alone. Opportunity. These guys, the sons of wealthy merchants, historically are jackasses. So they come up with the deal as let's go back to that guy's hometown. We'll seek this girl out, and hey, we can all have a good time. It's a little bit of a trip for that sort of escapade, but they are driven by a kind of evil, essentially. And so they go back and they contract with this local nun who turns out to be really quite corrupt and evil. She tells them stories about how her pupil went and infiltrated another merchant's home, stole a bunch of his stuff, pretended to seduce somebody who was chasing her when she was, and ended up killing him. Killing two people actually, and are getting away. These two little quick anecdotes that come by very quickly, again, telling stories, and all very curiously based on curiosity. The nun calls out specifically, well, are you curious? And there's that word curious that just gets repeated and is sort of hung out there. And you get that sense of, well, the curiosity to tell stories is almost part of that. And this is the mechanism that drags people through the 1001 Nights just a little bit after that draws a lot of inspiration from this work. If you are curious to hear the story, my sons, said the nun, I shall tell you. Listen. That is the same mechanism that is used in the 1001 Nights, which draws heavily from this work. And it's also that same notion of curiosity that hung up Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. The idea that curiosity is somehow dangerous, that curiosity can lead you astray. These four guys are curious about this wife, and so they go and they are led on this little sinful trip. And now they're sort of teased by the idea of a story, and so the nun teases them and gets them to sit and listen. It is all driven by curiosity, and that is played on again and again. And she tells the story that about her assistant, her pupil, and it is two short anecdotes based on greed and sexual avarice. And you can see again this treatment of sin that is very worldly, very earthly, and often quite funny. There's a lot of human rascality in here, let's say, and this is going to appeal to a wider group of people than just the queen that Samadeva is writing for. This is for a literate culture that is very worldly, that is very educated, but not necessarily pious. This isn't written for monks. And so you get this plot where the nun goes and says, "Okay, I'm going to go and get this wife, and I will bring you to them, bring you to her." So she goes and there is another story in this where she enters in and she goes into visits, and as a nun she is welcomed into the house, and to get in she passes a guard dog, and the dog starts growling at her. So she tosses so she takes note of this. She goes in and she talks to her, and then she comes back the next day and she tosses the dog a chunk of meat that's been dipped in pepper or sneezing powder or something like that. And the dog starts going into fits and his eyes are tearing. And she goes in to see Devasmita, the wife, and says, "Oh yeah, oh what a shame. I just saw your dog, and I realized that I used to know that person in another life, and the implication is that, well, as a nun, she can see, or as a spiritual person, she can remember past lives, which is very significant in the Hindu tradition. But it is also kind of a scam. It is a scam. She's lying. So you have this very immoral nun, very corrupt, who is lying and doing so for the sexual exploitation of this woman, but also brandishing around her priestly caste status as it's kind of a cheap trinket. Now, the story itself is not all that new. The story itself of the dog and the sneezing powder shows up all over the place. It shows up in. You could make an argument that it's. Well, there's a story in the 1001 Nights a little bit later. There are stories from Petrus Alfonsi in the Scholar's Guide a little bit before. It was drifting around the Arabian and South Asian territories quite notably. You could even make an argument that in the Iliad, or not in the Iliad, in Dante's Inferno, when Virgil throws a pack of mud, supposedly looking like a piece of meat, to the dog Cerberus to get them through to hell. The idea of the dog has to be subdued. The guard dog needs to be subdued to smooth the way for illicit activities. This is what we're dealing with. So again, it's another story. It's another story within the story, which is also within a story within a story. And all of these levels are very complicated, but there's an enormous amount of sophistication in the way Somadeva has stitched them all together. So in the end, when the wife Devasmita just recognizes, all right, this woman is sort of cheating me here. All right, I'm going to pay attention here because this story of the dog is kind of ridiculous. And she ends up luring in the brothers one at a time, stripping them naked, beating them senseless, drugging them, tossing them in a sewer, and even branding them on the forehead. And significantly, with the first one that happens to, goes back and he says, well, okay, if I admit this to my brothers, they will make fun of me, so I won't say it, and I'll just say I got robbed in the street coming home after a really good time. So each one of them goes and does this, which is, again, just a sign of real decadence and mendacity, to betray one's brothers for a sense of pride and almost resentment. It's a really dark view of humanity. But in the end, of course, the bride, the wife, decides, okay, now I'm going to go get my husband. I'm going to go to Indonesia. I'm going to find him out. And she goes and she sees she goes to the marketplace and looks around. She finds the king and says, okay, gather everyone together. I need to speak to them. Now, in the meantime, her husband in the marketplace has seen her dressed up. She is dressed as a man. She is in disguise as a merchant so that she can get in. And here you get echoes of, well, quite frankly, how many different Shakespeare characters that cross-dress to pass for something. And here she is dressed as a man. And there's a very odd moment where her husband sees her dressed as a man and becomes evidently, perhaps, a little sexually aroused at her dressed up as a man, not recognizing her, but seeing a man who looks somewhat womanly to her, and he kind of likes the look of her. A little bit iffy there. That is not really developed. But I would say that it is another sign of the kind of worldliness and the kind of sexually driven, lustful, and avaricious portrait of humanity that you see in this very ordinary, common story. Of course, the wife goes and says, okay, and those 4 guys over there, I see them. Those are brothers. Yeah, they are my escaped slaves. Take a look at their foreheads, and they're all wearing turbans to try and hide the scarring. But of course, the turbans get ripped off, and they go, oh my God! But right there, it's an interesting little moment because it's that reveal from quite a while earlier. Now, all along so far, you've been having these little chunks of narrative sort of stitched together in a very episodic way. There is a grand plot to it, of course, but that little detail that comes out that wasn't made a huge deal of earlier, that little detail comes out at the end, and it's, oh, hey, that's, oh my God, yeah, I forgot about that. And that signals a kind of sophistication that wouldn't have been around for earlier storytelling traditions, when the stories were much shorter, when the stories were much simpler, when the stories were just supposed to deliver a moral and that's it. Here, you've got something much more complicated. The idea of sophistication, the idea of the frame tale, the idea of the stories all having somewhat contradictory interpretations and convoluted meanings, always comes up. It's a sign of great artistry. It's a sign of great sophistication. It's a sign that there is another concept going on that's perhaps a little bit too smart for us, but we're always struggling to get there. This is all, of course, about calming a bride before her wedding. So there is this common theme of marriage, this common theme of fidelity, this common theme of love and the value of love and an ideal of love in a sordid world. But it's also about, well, quite frankly, childbirth. The bride's role is to produce children. And the paternity tale at the beginning sort of sets that note early. The idea of having children is so important. Now, significantly, the last story within this story is one told when the wife is conversing with her mother-in-law and saying, this is what I'm going to do, I'm going to go get him. That story comes out where she says, and I'm going to do it just like, and I forget the name. And the mother-in-law says, oh, what story is that? Which is an interesting little moment because she asked the exact question that needs to be asked for the wife to go and leap into the telling of the story. In a lot of ways, she plays the same role as Shahrazad's sister, Dinarzad, in the 1001 Nights. She's just there to say, really? What happened? That story is of an unfaithful husband who gets caught having an illicit affair with another woman inside of a temple. And this is apparently a big scandal. And so the wife goes and sneaks in and lets the mistress sneak out dressed as her. And that way, when the authorities rush in to supposedly, arrest them all they find is a husband and wife. And that is not necessarily illegal. As long as they are married, it's okay. Public sex, okay. But in this example, that this is the wife telling. In this example, she is comparing her husband to an unfaithful husband. As if there's an equivalence, which means as if it just doesn't matter whether fidelity is honored or not. The answer out of that is that, well, okay, yeah, it just doesn't matter. Be a good wife. And that means not really caring if he's unfaithful. Not really challenging that. Not pushing outside your lane. Not really objecting to the structure of society. And remember, this is a very, very structured society. So is it really just a story for women's entertainment? Or is it a warning shot? That is another question that suggests the sophistication of the tale, along with it's a thematic level, along with the structural level of these different stitched together aspects of the story that give a remarkably well-developed glimpse into the possibilities of narrative art in what is, for a lot of parts of the world, still a very primitive time. But here we see in India real artistry taking place.